The night was heavy with silence. Inside the royal chambers, where velvet curtains draped like shadows and the scent of burning wax hung in the air, a solitary figure sat motionless. The crown, polished and glittering, rested on a table beside her, yet it might as well have been a chain of iron. This was the queen, sovereign of a kingdom where whispers could kill, and where love itself was the most dangerous act of all. History remembers her not just as a monarch, but as a woman both admired and feared, a queen who executed her own lovers. Imagine, for a moment, the stillness of that chamber. A flickering candle throws her face into half-light, half-darkness. Outside, a guard's boots echo faintly against stone corridors, while the wind rattles through castle windows as if the world itself was restless. Within these walls, secrets were carried like daggers. Each word of affection, every stolen glance, could mean a rise to power, or a march to the scaffold. It is here, in this fragile tension between passion and peril, that her story begins. To those who watched her from afar, she seemed untouchable. Draped in silks, crowned with jewels, she carried herself like a goddess on earth. Her court bowed at her feet, ministers swore loyalty, and poets praised her beauty in words of trembling devotion. Yet behind the veil of power was a woman whose heart was not made of stone. She longed, as all humans do, for love, tenderness, and trust. But unlike the common people who might risk only heartbreak, her affections carried stakes that could shake kingdoms. For a queen, love was never private. Every whisper of romance became a matter of state. Each man who dared draw close to her became a figure of fascination, jealousy, and suspicion. If he was favored, rivals sought his ruin. If he was too ambitious, ministers saw treason. If he betrayed her, or even seemed to, the cost was death. Thus, her throne was both a seat of power and a stage where passion played out as tragedy. The image of her lover's downfall has lingered for centuries. Some accounts describe them as traitors who plotted against her. Others say they were simply victims of rumor, condemned by the queen's paranoia. Still others suggest that she wielded their deaths deliberately, as a show of authority, warning all who would dare mix desire with sovereignty. But no matter which version of events one believes, the truth is undeniable. Those who lay in her embrace could just as easily lie beneath the executioner's blade. The paradox of her life is what makes it unforgettable. She was both a woman of profound vulnerability and a ruler of ruthless resolve. When she smiled, hearts raced. When she frowned, lives trembled. The same lips that whispered promises of passion could command an executioner to sharpen his axe. That duality, the blending of love and death, made her story echo across centuries, carried in songs, chronicles, and the fearful legends of her people. In this story, there are no simple villains or heroes. There is only the delicate balance between desire and survival, between loyalty and betrayal, between power and the unbearable weight of loneliness. Her reign unfolded like a play, where each act was drenched in grandeur and shadow, and where the final curtain always seemed to fall in blood. Tonight, as we journey through her story, let us walk slowly, carefully, as though through the candlelit halls of her palace. Each corner hides a secret. Each echo of laughter may mask deceit. Each embrace may conceal a dagger. We will trace her path from the hopeful girl groomed for greatness, to the crowned ruler burdened by suspicion, to the woman remembered for executing those she once loved. But let us not rush. This is not the tale of a single moment, but of an entire life shaped by passion and paranoia. To understand her, we must see not only the blood on her hands, but the shadows that pressed upon her from all sides. Her kingdom was restless, her court filled with plots, her throne never secure. In such a world, every lover's kiss was also a gamble with destiny. So picture her again, in that chamber of silence. A queen whose heart and crown were locked in constant battle. On the table lies the symbol of her sovereignty, cold, heavy, unyielding. In her chest beats the symbol of her humanity, warm, fragile, yearning. The two could never fully coexist. Whenever love touched her, power demanded blood. Whenever desire drew near, betrayal was close behind. And so, history has left us with a haunting question. Was she cruel, or was she simply trapped by the crown she wore? Were those executions born of malice, or were they the desperate decisions of a ruler who could trust no one? Did she kill because she wanted to, or because she had to? These are questions that linger like the echo of a closing door in a darkened palace. As we begin this journey, allow the story to flow not as harsh judgment, but as a reflection of the timeless struggle between love and authority. Imagine the candlelight softening, the queen's figure fading into shadow. The chamber grows quiet again, except for the slow tolling of a distant bell, a reminder that time passes, that destinies unfold, that even the most powerful hearts can break. This is the story of a queen unlike any other. The queen who held the world in her hands, and who, in the name of power, ordered her lovers to the executioner. A tale of majesty and mourning, of beauty draped in blood, of a woman whose legend is carved into the very silence of history. And with that, we step into her world. To truly understand the queen who executed her own lovers, we must step back from the dim glow of her chamber and widen our gaze. The stage of her life was not an island, but a continent ablaze with turmoil. Across Europe, the 16th and 17th centuries were marked by upheaval, where the fate of kingdoms was written in both ink and blood. This was the world she inherited, a place where power and passion were inseparably bound, and where the throne was not a seat of peace, but a battlefield. Imagine Europe in this era. Empires rose and fell like waves against a storm-tossed shore. The Holy Roman Empire fractured under the weight of endless disputes. The Ottoman Empire pressed against Europe's borders, fierce and unyielding. Spain glittered with the wealth of the New World, while England sharpened its teeth against rivals across the sea. France, Italy, the German states, each was caught in a ceaseless dance of war, diplomacy, and treachery. The map was not drawn in ink alone but in shifting alliances and rivers of blood. Religion, too, was tearing the fabric of nations. The Reformation had cracked Christendom apart. Where once the continent bent beneath the authority of Rome, now Protestant princes defied the Pope, and kings chose sides not just for faith but for survival. A single choice of creed could decide whether a monarch held onto a throne or was torn down by rebellion. For queens especially, the matter was treacherous. Devotion to one faith might invite the love of some subjects but the hatred of others. It was an age where rulers could not afford to separate their personal lives from their political roles. A king's marriage was not just about affection but about dynastic survival. A queen's choice of husband or lover was not merely a private affair, it was a signal to foreign powers, a declaration of loyalty or hostility, a spark that could ignite war. In such a world, the queen at the heart of our story was never free to love as she pleased. Each of her choices was magnified by the lens of politics, and each man who came near her was viewed not just as a companion, but as a weapon, a risk, or a threat. The courts of Europe were not places of serenity, but of constant vigilance. Picture a grand hall lined with tapestries and marble, where nobles bowed and smiled with carefully measured grace. Beneath every bow, however, lay ambition. Behind every smile, a concealed dagger. Servants whispered messages across corridors, ministers plotted alliances in secret, ambassadors carried letters with double meanings. At night, when candles burned low, shadows themselves seemed to carry secrets. In this theater of deceit, love was never innocent. To lay one's heart bare was to risk ruin. And so, monarchs learned to wield love itself as a tool of survival. Kings arranged marriages not for companionship but for alliances, binding kingdoms together through vows spoken at altars. Queens, often without the freedom to choose their husbands, found themselves navigating a web of desire and duty where every touch of romance could carry political weight. The queen we follow was no exception. She had been born into this world of chess and knives, and she quickly learned the rules of its dangerous game. But while this ruthless environment shaped her, it also shaped how her people judged her. A male ruler could take mistresses freely and suffer little more than scandal. A queen, however, was held to an impossible standard. Her love life was not just gossip, it was national policy. If she loved unwisely, she risked betrayal. If she chose too boldly, she risked the wrath of her ministers. If she trusted too deeply, she risked her crown. And if she appeared merciless, she risked her humanity. This was the cruel paradox of her time. To survive as a woman on the throne, she had to be sharper, colder, and more ruthless than the men around her. But to rule without affection, to strip herself of love entirely, was to become isolated, despised, and feared. In this impossible balance, every decision she made would carry echoes of contradiction, the longing for intimacy on one hand, and the unrelenting demands of sovereignty on the other. Consider, too, the role of rumor. In a Europe so charged with intrigue, whispers were weapons as sharp as swords. A letter slipped under a door, a murmur in the ear of a minister, a look exchanged in a banquet hall, any of these could topple a courtier or condemn a lover. The queen's very reputation was a battlefield. Enemies would spread tales of her passions, real or imagined, twisting affection into accusations of scandal. The more powerful she grew, the more dangerous her heart became to those around her. And so, the executions that would later define her were not born in a vacuum. They were born in a Europe where survival meant striking first, where loyalty was temporary and betrayal inevitable, where crowns were not passed peacefully but defended with sharpened steel. The Queen's actions must be understood in this context, a time when power was constantly under siege, and when rulers knew that even the most private of desires could bring about a nation's downfall. In this world, she became both a mirror and a force. A mirror of the ruthless age that demanded strength at any cost, and a force who carved her own legend in defiance of its cruelty. She was not the only monarch to live in the shadows of suspicion and scandal, but she was one of the few who allowed her personal passions to bleed so visibly into her politics. That visibility would make her unforgettable, long after others faded into the dust of chronicles. So when we imagine her ordering the death of a lover, we must not imagine it as a solitary act of cruelty. We must see it as the product of her world, a world in which kings betrayed their wives, nobles betrayed their kings, and nations betrayed their faith. It was a Europe in constant motion, caught between light and darkness, and she was a queen forced to balance herself at the very heart of it. This is why her story matters. She was not merely a tragic figure of romance gone wrong, nor merely a ruthless ruler who saw betrayal in every shadow. She was both, shaped by the storm of her age. To understand her actions is to understand the Europe of ruthless monarchs, a world where passion could topple kingdoms, and where the line between love and treason was no thicker than a whisper. And so we move closer to her, not yet into her heart, but into her origins. For in the next part of our journey, we turn to her childhood, to the early days when she was not yet a queen surrounded by daggers, but a girl being molded by destiny, unaware of the blood that awaited her crown. She was not born as an ordinary child. From the first breath she drew, her life belonged not to herself but to the crown that awaited her. The cradle in which she slept was not just a place of comfort, it was a stage upon which the hopes, fears, and ambitions of a dynasty were projected. Courtiers looked upon her tiny form and whispered predictions. Ministers debated her future even as she learned to walk. And beyond the palace walls, the people saw in her birth both a blessing and a question. Could this fragile infant one day hold the weight of a kingdom torn by turmoil? Her childhood was one of extraordinary contrasts. On one hand, she was surrounded by luxuries beyond imagination. Silks from the East brushed against her skin, golden toys lay at her bedside, and tutors spoke to her in the refined tones of Latin, Greek, and the languages of neighboring courts. Every object, every gesture, every sound around her was designed to mold her into more than just a child. She was a future sovereign, a daughter of destiny. On the other hand, shadows hung heavy even in her nursery. For every lullaby sung to soothe her, there was a hushed warning about betrayal. For every lesson in grace and poise, there was a reminder that trust could kill. Children of monarchs rarely knew innocence, but for her it was especially fleeting. Even before she could read, she could sense the tension in the air, the constant murmur of advisers, the nervous eyes of servants who carried secrets in silence, the way her parents' voices lowered when discussing matters of state. She learned early that words were dangerous things, to be spoken carefully and weighed before leaving the lips. To be royal was to live in a cage of splendor, where golden bars shone brilliantly but imprisoned nonetheless. Her tutors played an enormous role in shaping her worldview. She was instructed in the arts of diplomacy, history, and statecraft long before most children even learned arithmetic. Stories of great rulers were read to her not as entertainment, but as lessons. She was taught that Julius Caesar's brilliance was undone by betrayal, that Cleopatra's beauty was both her power and her downfall, that Elizabeth's and Catherine's of history could bend nations with their will but always at a price. These stories were not fairy tales, they were warnings, preparing her to wear the crown with both majesty and suspicion. Yet she was still human, still a child who longed for tenderness. There were moments when she would run through the palace gardens, chasing butterflies, laughing with the rare abandon of youth. In those fleeting instants, she might have seemed like any other girl, caught up in the wonders of the natural world. But inevitably, her steps were drawn back inside, back to the reality of tapestries depicting battles, of advisors hovering with scrolls, of watchful eyes reminding her that destiny would never allow her to remain ordinary. One of the most profound lessons she absorbed came not from books or tutors, but from watching those around her. She observed her parents, perhaps a king and queen themselves, or perhaps regents, depending on the exact dynasty, navigating the treacherous waters of politics. She saw how smiles could be weapons, how silence could be louder than words, and how even at feasts, joy could conceal plotting. She realized early that in her world, trust was not freely given. It was calculated, measured, and often betrayed. From this, she drew the conclusion that love, too, would be complicated and perhaps dangerous. It was in adolescence that her intelligence began to shine most brilliantly. Courtiers noted her sharp memory, her ability to listen to conversations and recall them word for word, her uncanny gift for reading people's expressions. She could tell when someone was lying, when someone was hiding fear, when someone was desperate for favor. This instinct made her admired but also feared. Even as a girl, she carried an aura of inevitability, as though her destiny was already written across her face. But there was another side to her, one that history often overlooks. She was not merely a calculating future monarch, but also a young woman with desires, dreams, and doubts. She read poetry in stolen hours, letting the verses of love and longing whisper to her in ways that her tutors never encouraged. She sometimes wrote in journals, reflections of her own secret hopes. Though those writings may never have survived, one can imagine her questions. Would she ever know true affection? Would anyone love her for herself, not for her crown? Would she always be forced to choose between her heart and her throne? Her adolescence also brought the realization of danger. Rumors occasionally reached her ears of poisoned goblets, of assassins in distant lands, of queens who had fallen because they trusted the wrong man. These stories imprinted themselves deeply in her mind. She came to understand that her greatest weapon would be vigilance, and her greatest weakness would be vulnerability. Love, then, was a double-edged sword, beautiful but deadly, tempting but perilous. As she matured into womanhood, these lessons hardened into instinct. She learned how to hold her expression steady even when her heart wavered. She practiced the art of listening without revealing her own thoughts. She mastered the ability to flatter without committing, to inspire loyalty without giving trust, to charm without surrendering. In short, she became not just a young woman but a ruler in waiting, her personality sculpted by the invisible hands of expectation and necessity. Yet destiny has a way of weaving threads of irony into its tapestry. For even as she prepared herself to be untouchable, she could not silence the part of her that longed to be touched, not by courtiers or allies, but by genuine affection. That tension, between the queen she was meant to be and the woman she was within, would become the defining struggle of her reign. And it was from this struggle that tragedy would one day grow. The image of her as a girl walking through candlelit corridors, her eyes reflecting both curiosity and caution, is a powerful one. In those eyes lay the blueprint of her future. They carried the weight of history, the shadows of betrayal yet to come, and the glow of passions that would ignite kingdoms. She was a daughter of destiny, not because she chose this path, but because it was thrust upon her from birth. As we close this chapter of her life, we see her standing at the threshold of adulthood. Behind her lies the innocence of childhood, fragile and fleeting. Ahead of her lies the crown, glittering and merciless. She does not yet know that her lovers will one day kneel before her only to be condemned. She does not yet know that her heart, once full of longing, will be weighed down with suspicion and sorrow. But she can sense it, like a storm building on the horizon, and she steels herself for it even as she yearns for something softer. In her youth, destiny was written upon her like an invisible script, and every lesson she learned prepared her for the stage she would soon ascend. The child was gone, the queen was awakening. And with her awakening came the quiet, ominous truth that love in her world was not a gift, but a gamble. The day of her coronation dawned not with the warmth of spring, but with the heavy weight of destiny. Bells tolled across the city, their iron voices echoing through narrow streets and over crowded squares. From every window, faces leaned out to catch a glimpse of their new ruler. Merchants closed their shops, peasants left their fields, and nobles rode proudly in procession. For the people, it was a day of celebration. For her, it was the day when the last fragments of childhood slipped away, and the crown, gleaming yet merciless, settled upon her head. The coronation itself was a spectacle of both grandeur and ritual. The cathedral glowed with candlelight, the air thick with incense, and choirs raised voices in solemn chants that seemed to bind heaven and earth together. She walked the long aisle, her robes trailing behind her like rivers of silk, every step echoing on the stone floor as thousands of eyes watched in silence. To the people, she was radiant, the embodiment of majesty, chosen by divine will. To herself, she felt the crushing pressure of expectation pressing down heavier than the crown soon would. When at last the crown was lowered onto her head, its weight was more than physical. It was a symbol of all that had been given up and all that must be endured. In that moment, she became not just a woman, but a sovereign. The throne awaited her, and with it came power, glory, and danger. The cheers of the crowd outside swelled into thunder, but deep within her heart there was no comfort. For with every cheer, she knew the people expected not only a queen who could rule, but one who could never falter, never be vulnerable. Yet even as she smiled for her people, her heart stirred with conflicting desires. To rule was to stand apart, untouchable, cloaked in distance. But to live as a woman was to long for closeness, for tenderness, for love. How could she reconcile these two halves of herself? How could she be both the queen who inspired awe and the woman who yearned for a hand to hold in the shadows of night? This question would haunt her reign, shaping every decision, every passion, every tragedy. As she settled into the early days of her rule, she discovered quickly that the throne was a lonely place. Advisors crowded her chambers daily, each bearing proposals, demands, and warnings. Nobles sought favor, ambassadors pressed alliances, and ministers argued over policy. Their voices filled her days, but none of them touched her soul. Behind the mask of authority she was expected to wear, she felt the ache of isolation. In the grandeur of her palace, amid marble columns and golden ceilings, silence was often her only true companion. It was in this silence that her heart began to wander. She noticed the glances of young courtiers, the soft words of poets, the gallant smiles of soldiers. She saw in them something she could not find in the rigid world of politics: warmth, spontaneity, humanity. These men did not speak in endless calculations of diplomacy, they spoke in words of admiration, of loyalty, of passion. And though she knew well the dangers of such attention, she found herself drawn to it. For behind the crown still beat a heart that longed to feel alive. But she was no naive girl. The lessons of her childhood echoed in her mind. She remembered the warnings whispered by tutors and the examples carved into history: rulers undone by trust, monarchs betrayed by their lovers. She knew that her throne was never secure, that the smallest scandal could be twisted into a weapon by enemies. And so, she balanced precariously, giving herself moments of closeness, yet never fully surrendering her guard. Every smile she returned, every word she entertained, was shadowed by the knowledge that affection could cost her everything. The duality of her life became ever more pronounced. In public, she was every inch the queen, majestic, commanding, and untouchable. She issued decrees with a steady voice, rode through her cities with a regal wave, and stood in her court like a figure carved from marble. Ministers respected her, rivals feared her, and subjects revered her. Yet in private, she was still a woman who lay awake at night, staring into the darkness, wondering whether anyone truly knew her. Her crown glistened in candlelight on the table beside her bed, but no crown could warm the emptiness of a heart unfulfilled. It is here, in these early years of her reign, that the seeds of tragedy were sown. For though she wielded authority with brilliance, though she outmaneuvered rivals and secured her throne, she could not master the conflict within herself. She longed for love, not as a tool, not as a political contract, but as a refuge. And yet, she feared it as much as she craved it. She feared that to love was to risk betrayal, to risk humiliation, to risk the collapse of everything she had built. This fear and longing intertwined until they became inseparable. The first whispers of romance began to stir in her court. A glance exchanged with a favored noble during a feast. A letter of poetry slipped discreetly into her chambers. A knight who lingered too long when kneeling before her. None of these gestures escaped notice. Courtiers, hungry for scandal, began to murmur. Ministers watched with unease, calculating what such attachments might mean for policy, for alliances, for their own positions. In her palace, nothing was invisible. Every flicker of her heart was mirrored and magnified until it became a question of state. The tension between crown and heart grew sharper. To deny herself love entirely was to live in endless loneliness. To embrace it was to risk her throne. And yet, as history would soon show, she would not be able to resist forever. The woman within her, fragile and yearning, would one day overpower the queen, and the consequences would be written in blood. For now, in these early years, she held herself carefully, walking the tightrope between desire and duty. The world saw her as unshakable, but only she knew the storm gathering beneath her calm. The crown was hers, and with it came unmatched power. But the heart still beat beneath it, restless, vulnerable, and desperate for something that power could never provide. As she gazed from her throne over her kingdom, the vast fields, the bustling towns, the cathedrals reaching toward the sky, she appeared to possess everything. Yet inside, she understood the terrible truth, that the crown and the heart were enemies, forever pulling her in opposite directions. And sooner or later, she would be forced to choose. And so the stage was set for what was to come. The queen, radiant in her majesty, but restless in her soul. The kingdom, stable yet simmering with rumors. The heart, quiet but yearning, waiting for the moment when it would no longer remain silent. That moment, when it arrived, would change her life, and the lives of her lovers, forever. In the great halls of her palace, beneath vaulted ceilings adorned with tapestries of conquest and faith, the queen moved like a vision of power. Every gesture, every word, every glance was calculated to inspire awe and loyalty. But beyond the gilded thrones and polished marble floors, behind the curtain of statecraft and ritual, her heart began to beat in defiance of her crown. The story of her reign was no longer only the story of governance and survival, it became the story of desire, of dangerous attachments, of forbidden lovers who would shape both her destiny and the fate of her kingdom. The first of these men entered her life quietly, almost invisibly, as if carried by fate itself. He was not the most powerful noble in the land, nor the wealthiest, nor the most ambitious. But he was young, gallant, and brave. A soldier whose loyalty to the crown was evident in his every word, and whose devotion to her was deeper still. Their encounters began in the formal way such things often do. He knelt before her in the grand hall, pledging his sword to her service. She rewarded him with words of honor, never suspecting that his presence would soon stir something in her soul that politics could not contain. At first, it was harmless, or so she told herself. A smile too long, a gaze held just a moment past propriety. A conversation in which the air between them grew heavy with unspoken longing. He was her subject, her servant, her soldier. She was his sovereign, his unreachable star. And yet, in the silent glances exchanged when no one was watching, they both felt the dangerous truth. They were no longer merely queen and knight, but woman and man. The palace, however, was never a place for secrecy. Courtiers observed everything, ministers whispered about anything, and servants carried gossip like wildfire. Soon, rumors began to circulate, rumors of a knight who lingered too close to his queen, of a sovereign who allowed her heart to stray from the duties of her throne. Ministers grew uneasy. They had seen such stories before in the histories of other kingdoms, and they knew how swiftly a sovereign could fall when love eclipsed caution. But the queen was not blind. She knew the dangers better than anyone. Every embrace she imagined, every letter she longed to write but dared not, came with the knowledge that discovery could mean ruin. And yet, the heart is a force that defies reason. Against her better judgment, she allowed herself to grow attached. Their conversations deepened, their meetings became more frequent, and the line between ruler and lover began to blur. Soon, he was not the only one. For the queen, who had long been starved of genuine affection, found herself drawn to others as well. A poet who praised her beauty not in the language of politics, but in the language of art. A courtier whose wit and charm made her laugh in ways she had not laughed since her youth. A foreign ambassador whose exotic manners and daring words awakened her curiosity. None of them could be her equal, none could ever stand beside her throne, but each in their own way offered her something she craved: companionship, passion, escape. To some, these attachments may seem careless, even reckless. But one must remember the loneliness of her position. The queen, though surrounded daily by hundreds, lived in an isolation few could imagine. No one dared speak to her as a woman, no one dared see her beyond the majesty of her crown. In these forbidden lovers, she glimpsed fragments of a life she could never have, a life of warmth, intimacy, and freedom. And though she knew it could not last, she embraced it all the same, as though clutching a flame that she knew might one day burn her. The consequences began slowly, like cracks forming in glass. Ministers muttered about her judgment. Nobles grew bold, believing that her attachments might be used as leverage. Foreign rulers watched with keen eyes, seeking opportunities to exploit her heart for political gain. Even the church, which had blessed her coronation, began to frown upon the whispers of her affairs, warning that such indulgence could invite scandal upon the throne. And yet, the queen pressed on. She was too clever to be ruled entirely by passion, but too human to deny it. She played her lovers against one another, careful never to give too much of herself to any single man. Some she dismissed when the rumors grew too loud. Others she kept close, protected not only by affection but by her authority. Always, she balanced between desire and survival, between the heart that longed to live and the crown that demanded control. But balance cannot last forever. In time, one lover grew too bold, whispering promises of a future together. Another became too ambitious, imagining that her affection might grant him power beyond his station. And still another, betrayed by jealousy, spoke carelessly, allowing hints of their intimacy to escape into the hungry ears of the court. The palace, once a sanctuary for her passions, became a web of intrigue and suspicion. Every gesture was scrutinized, every letter intercepted, every glance transformed into evidence of scandal. It was then that the queen learned the cruel truth, that for a sovereign, love is never private. Her affairs were not merely personal, they were political weapons. Enemies began to use them to question her judgment, to undermine her authority, to whisper that she was a woman too easily swayed by her heart. Ministers, once loyal, began to waver. Allies grew distant. Even her subjects, though still devoted, began to wonder if their queen was as unshakable as she appeared. And yet, despite all this, she could not stop. The heart is not so easily silenced. Each time she tried to pull away, loneliness dragged her back. Each time she promised herself that her throne must come first, desire whispered otherwise. It was a cycle she could not escape, and with every passing season, the risks grew greater. The story of her forbidden lovers was not only the story of passion, but the story of betrayal. Some of these men, once dear to her, would turn against her in pursuit of power or out of wounded pride. Others would be torn from her side by jealous rivals or political necessity. Still others would remain loyal, but their very loyalty would make them targets of suspicion and envy. The queen, though brilliant in her statecraft, found herself ensnared in a game of hearts where every move carried the weight of destiny. What began as glances across a hall and whispers in darkened corridors soon became the stuff of legend, a queen whose heart was too fierce to be contained, and whose lovers would one day be her undoing. But in these early years, before the storm fully broke, there was still a fragile beauty in it all. In stolen moments beneath candlelight, in words exchanged behind heavy doors, in the simple, human longing that pulsed beneath the crown, the queen tasted the sweetness of a life denied to her. History would remember her affairs as scandal. Ministers would record them as folly. Enemies would twist them into daggers. But to her, they were not sins or weaknesses. They were the only moments when she was truly alive. And so, though she knew the dangers, she embraced her forbidden lovers all the same, not as a queen, but as a woman who refused to let duty consume her heart entirely. The tragedy, of course, was that such defiance could not last. The crown and the heart were destined to clash, and when they did, the flames would consume not only her lovers, but her reign itself. The air in the palace began to change. Where once the queen's presence inspired awe and reverence, now it stirred curiosity, whispers, and unease. Ministers who had once bent low in loyalty began to look sideways at one another, silently questioning how much power their sovereign still truly held over her own court. The innocence of her youth, the aura of untouchable majesty that had once shielded her, was slowly unraveling under the weight of rumor, passion, and betrayal. The queen, though still regal in bearing and sharp in intellect, could feel the shift herself. Her throne remained firm beneath her, but around its gilded legs the ground was beginning to soften. Every time she entered the great hall, she could sense eyes upon her, measuring her not only as ruler but as a woman, watching for signs of weakness, scandal, or indulgence. And though she commanded her ministers with the same clarity as before, she could not silence the quiet murmurs that rose in her absence. The fall of innocence did not happen in a single moment. It crept in, subtle and insidious, like shadows lengthening with the setting sun. It began with the first betrayal. One of her lovers, who had once sworn eternal devotion, revealed to others the private details of their intimacy. Whether from jealousy, ambition, or simple recklessness, his words became daggers in the mouths of rivals. Soon, fragments of their relationship were carried on the winds of gossip, embroidered into scandalous stories by those who sought to tarnish her. What was once a guarded secret became a weapon wielded against her. For the queen, this revelation struck deep. It was not simply the exposure of her private self, it was the realization that trust, which she had given so sparingly, could be broken so easily. The betrayal cut her more deeply than the harshest words of her enemies, for it came not from across the battlefield or the council chamber, but from within the circle of her own heart. The innocence she lost was not only her reputation's purity, but her belief in the sanctuary of affection itself. As the scandal spread, her ministers grew emboldened. Some began to challenge her decisions more openly, disguising their defiance as concern for the crown. Others whispered among themselves, weighing the possibility of using her vulnerability to expand their own influence. Nobles outside the palace heard the rumors too, and where once they had spoken of her majesty in tones of reverence, now they muttered of weakness, instability, and temptation. The queen, however, was not one to crumble. Her spirit, though wounded, remained fierce. She redoubled her efforts in governance, pushing through decrees that strengthened her armies, secured her borders, and improved the lives of her subjects. She stood taller on her throne, projecting an image of control that few dared challenge directly. Yet beneath this mask of power, she was forced to carry the growing weight of suspicion. Every lover who approached her was now shadowed by doubt. Every gesture of kindness she offered was measured against the possibility of scandal. Still, she could not entirely silence her heart. Though her innocence in love had been broken, her longing remained. She sought companionship not only from passion but from necessity, clinging to moments of closeness as the storm around her grew darker. But with each new connection came greater risk. Her enemies watched carefully, waiting for another weakness to exploit. Each whisper of romance was now ammunition. Each act of tenderness, a potential threat to her reign. The fall of innocence also revealed itself in the queen's own transformation. The woman who had once looked at her lovers with the naive belief that affection could coexist with power now regarded them with sharper eyes. She learned to read their intentions, to weigh their ambitions, to test their loyalty before giving her trust. What had begun as genuine yearning for love slowly hardened into a game of survival. Passion became entangled with politics, and desire became a tool to be wielded carefully rather than a gift freely given. But even as she adapted, the price of her earlier missteps began to mount. Foreign envoys carried tales of her affairs back to their monarchs, who viewed her with both curiosity and disdain. Alliances grew uncertain, for kings and princes wondered if a sovereign who could be swayed by her heart could also be swayed in matters of state. Diplomacy became more difficult, her words weighed against her reputation rather than her policies. Inside her court, the whispers grew louder still. Some accused her of weakness, others of cruelty. Some suggested that her lovers held secret power over her decisions, guiding the crown for their own ends. Ministers who once defended her now hesitated, fearing that her scandals would stain their own reputations. And yet, despite it all, she endured. She held her throne not because her court was united in loyalty, but because they were divided in ambition. None dared strike openly, for fear of the chaos that might follow. For her, the greatest pain was not in the politics, but in the loneliness that deepened with every betrayal. The innocence of trust, the simple belief that love could exist untainted in the shadow of the crown, was gone. She knew now that every man who entered her life might one day be her downfall. And still, her heart, stubborn and human, yearned for what her crown denied her. The people, too, began to sense the shift. Though many still loved her for her strength and beauty, others whispered doubts in the marketplace. Mothers told their daughters cautionary tales of queens who fell because of reckless passions. Priests warned of divine judgment upon rulers who strayed from the path of purity. And yet, for all the murmurs, the common people remained loyal. They had seen her govern with wisdom, protect them from enemies, and grant them stability in uncertain times. Their love for her was not easily broken, though it grew increasingly fragile. This period of her reign became defined by contradiction. She was both strong and vulnerable, adored and condemned, brilliant and flawed. She was no longer the untouchable sovereign of her early years, but a woman marked by the scars of her own choices. Her reign remained secure, but her innocence, both in love and in rule, was gone forever. Power is never still. It flows like a river, changing its course, eroding its banks, carving new channels where least expected. For the queen, the river of her reign had once flowed with steady strength, carrying her from triumph to triumph. But now, it grew treacherous, filled with hidden currents and sudden storms. The court, once united under her command, began to fracture into camps of loyalty and ambition. The queen who had once been revered as untouchable now stood in a palace where whispers were as sharp as daggers, and betrayal waited behind every smile. The first cracks appeared among her ministers. They had long depended on her firm hand to guide them, to settle disputes, to maintain the balance of power that allowed each of them a share of influence. But as rumors of her private affairs spread, so too did doubts about her judgment. One minister, emboldened by her vulnerability, began to speak against her policies in council. Another courted foreign allies, hinting that the queen's throne might soon be open to challenge. A third, once her most trusted advisor, grew cautious and distant, unwilling to be stained by the scandals that surrounded her. For the queen, these shifting allegiances were as painful as they were dangerous. She had always understood that her ministers were ambitious men, but she had believed her authority could hold them in line. Now, she realized that their loyalty had been rooted not only in fear of her crown but in the aura of majesty she had once carried without question. That aura was dimmed now, clouded by whispers of weakness. And without it, the wolves of ambition began to circle. Betrayal, however, did not come only from ministers. It came from those closest to her heart. One lover, embittered by jealousy, revealed secret words she had spoken in confidence, words twisted into evidence of recklessness. Another, fearful of losing her favor, conspired with her enemies to protect his own standing. Even among her attendants, betrayal took root. Servants who once served with silent devotion now passed letters to her rivals, eager to exchange loyalty for coin or favor. The queen's palace became a maze of intrigue. Every corridor seemed to echo with secrets, every chamber was shadowed by plots. To survive, she learned to wield suspicion as a weapon. She listened more carefully than ever before, watching faces as ministers spoke, weighing each word for hidden meaning. She studied the movements of her lovers, the loyalties of her guards, the alliances forming among her nobles. Betrayal had made her wary, but it had also made her sharper, more cunning. She could no longer afford innocence. She could no longer afford trust. And yet, the cost of this vigilance was immense. Her heart grew heavy with the weight of suspicion, her nights restless with fear of treachery. Once, she had dreamed of ruling with both wisdom and warmth, of being loved as well as obeyed. Now she saw that love, whether from ministers, nobles, or lovers, could not be trusted. Power was the only constant. Betrayal was its shadow. But the queen was not a woman to surrender. If betrayal surrounded her, she would use betrayal in turn. She began to play her ministers against one another, feeding them promises and half-truths, ensuring that none could grow strong enough to challenge her directly. She rewarded loyalty with lavish gifts, but punished suspicion with sudden and decisive cruelty. A noble who spread rumors of her weakness found his lands stripped and his allies scattered. A minister who conspired with foreign powers was exposed, disgraced, and cast from court. Even among her lovers, she grew ruthless. Those who betrayed her met with exile, or worse. Her enemies had thought her scandals would break her. Instead, they forged her into something fiercer. If she could not be innocent, she would be formidable. If she could not be loved, she would be feared. She cloaked herself in majesty again, not the untarnished majesty of her youth, but the hard, unyielding majesty of a ruler who had survived betrayal and would survive again. And yet, for all her strength, the betrayals left scars. She could not banish the memory of those who had once sworn devotion, only to turn against her. She could not silence the ache of trust broken, of affection soured into treachery. Behind her stern gaze, she remained a woman who longed for loyalty, who longed for love untainted by ambition. But the crown would not allow it. Every bond she formed was bound to power, and every bond risked betrayal. The people, too, felt the weight of this transformation. They still admired her brilliance, still respected her strength. But they also saw the shadow that had fallen across her reign. They whispered of ministers who vanished without explanation, of lovers who were executed for crimes never fully named, of nobles who lost everything after crossing her. Some called her ruthless. Others called her just. All agreed that she was no longer the same queen they had once adored. Power and betrayal became the twin forces of her reign. They fed each other, entwined like serpents. Each betrayal demanded a display of power. Each display of power bred new resentment, which in turn bred new betrayal. The queen moved carefully across this shifting ground, but the cycle could not be broken. It was the price of her crown, the price of her heart, the price of survival itself. Still, she endured. In council, her voice was calm and commanding, her decrees carried the weight of destiny. In public, she appeared radiant, every gesture precise, every word deliberate. The people saw their queen and believed her as strong as ever. Only in the solitude of her chambers did the mask fall, and the woman beneath the crown felt the ache of her burdens. Alone, she whispered to herself that she must endure, for there was no other path. The story of this time was not merely one of survival. It was the shaping of legend. For history would not remember her as a queen untouched by scandal or shielded from betrayal. It would remember her as the queen who outlasted them all, who stood upon her throne while others plotted and fell, who wielded power not as a gift but as a weapon. In the fire of betrayal, she was reforged into steel. And yet, history would also whisper of the cost. For every act of betrayal she endured, she became less the woman she had once been. The laughter of her youth, the warmth of her innocence, the tenderness of her heart, all were shadows now, replaced by caution, calculation, and iron resolve. The crown had demanded her loyalty. Betrayal had demanded her transformation. And together, they left her both stronger and more alone than she had ever been. This was the paradox of her reign, that betrayal, meant to destroy her, became the very force that strengthened her throne. But it also ensured that the queen who ruled was no longer the queen who had begun. The innocence was gone forever. In its place stood a ruler forged in fire, a queen who knew that to wear a crown was to carry betrayal in its shadow, and that power, once touched by treachery, could never again be pure. For centuries, rulers had wielded swords, armies, and gold as instruments of power. But the queen discovered another weapon, one subtler, more dangerous, and infinitely more intimate: love. If betrayal had hardened her heart, it had also sharpened her instincts. She came to see affection not merely as a human longing but as a political tool, as potent as any army. Where others used war to conquer, she used desire. Where others built alliances through treaties, she forged them through the bonds of the heart. And though such tactics carried risks, they also gave her an advantage no minister, noble, or rival sovereign could anticipate. In the beginning, this transformation was not deliberate. Love had once been her weakness, a vulnerability that exposed her to whispers and betrayal. But as the palace filled with intrigue and enemies lurked in every corner, she realized that what had once endangered her could, if carefully controlled, become her greatest strength. The men who sought her affection could be turned into instruments of her will. Those who adored her would fight not only for her crown but for her heart. And those who feared losing her favor would cling to her with desperate loyalty. The queen began to wield her beauty, her wit, and her charm with calculated precision. She did not give her heart freely, as she once had, but bestowed fragments of it like gifts, each designed to inspire devotion. A minister who hesitated in council found himself flattered by her attention, suddenly eager to defend her decrees. A noble who grumbled about her rule discovered her smile upon him, and with it, the promise of favor. Even foreign envoys who entered her presence with suspicion often left enthralled, their judgments softened by her allure. Her lovers, too, became more than companions. They became pawns in her strategy, though few realized it. Some she placed in positions of influence, ensuring that their loyalty to her bound them more tightly than their loyalty to the state. Others she allowed to believe they held her deepest trust, when in truth they were watched carefully, their ambitions measured against her own designs. A select few she used as symbols, their closeness displayed publicly to remind rivals that her heart, like her throne, could not be conquered without her consent. But love as a weapon was not merely about seduction. It was about understanding the power of desire itself. She saw how men unraveled when they believed themselves chosen, how they betrayed allies, abandoned principles, even risked ruin, all for a smile or a whispered word from her lips. She did not need to draw her sword to defeat them, she needed only to draw them into her orbit, where their own hearts would undo them. Yet this weapon was double-edged. The queen, though hardened, was still human. There were moments when she found herself slipping into genuine affection, moments when the weapon of love threatened to turn once again into weakness. She fought these impulses with all her strength, reminding herself that she could not afford to be vulnerable. And yet, in the quiet of night, she sometimes wondered if she was using love or if love was using her, shaping her choices, steering her fate, binding her in ways she could neither escape nor entirely control. The court, meanwhile, grew increasingly aware of her tactics. Ministers whispered of her power to enchant, to ensnare, to bend even the strongest wills. Some feared her allure, keeping their distance lest they be caught in her web. Others pursued her more fervently, eager for the favor and influence that intimacy with the queen might bring. Her palace became a theater of hearts, each noble and courtier playing their part in a drama where affection and ambition were indistinguishable. Beyond the palace walls, stories of her power spread among her people. Some praised her as a sovereign who could command both minds and hearts, a ruler whose charm was as mighty as her armies. Others condemned her as manipulative, warning that no kingdom could be safe when its ruler treated love as a tool. Priests spoke of temptation, poets spoke of enchantment, and common folk debated whether their queen was a goddess of passion or a sorceress of deceit. But the queen herself cared little for their judgment. She knew that to rule was to survive, and survival demanded weapons of every kind. Love had nearly destroyed her once, but now she wielded it with skill that made her unstoppable. She did not see herself as cruel, for she still cared deeply for her kingdom, still worked tirelessly to strengthen her people's prosperity. Rather, she saw herself as pragmatic, using every resource available to her, even the dangerous resource of the human heart. One of the most striking examples of her strategy came during a period of looming war. A rival kingdom threatened her borders, its king confident that her court scandals had weakened her. But instead of meeting him first with armies, she met him with charm. Through emissaries and envoys, through banquets and letters, she turned his generals against one another, sowing division with carefully placed affection and attention. By the time her armies marched, her enemy's unity had already fractured. She won not only through force but through the quiet, invisible weapon of desire. And yet, every victory carried a cost. For each man who loved her too deeply and found himself discarded, an enemy was born. Each broken heart was a potential betrayal waiting to unfold. The queen could command armies, but she could not command the bitterness of those she left behind. And as the years passed, the list of those who had once been close to her but now despised her grew longer. Her ministers, too, began to fear her methods. They saw how easily she could sway them, how quickly she could turn favor into threat. Some grew cautious, avoiding her presence unless necessary. Others tried to resist, though even resistance often collapsed beneath her gaze. But all of them knew that the queen's power no longer rested solely on her crown. It rested on something far more unpredictable, her mastery of the human heart. In this period, her reign took on an almost mythical quality. Songs were sung of her beauty, of men who had given everything for her love, of enemies undone not by battle but by longing. Yet beneath the poetry lay a harder truth: she was alone. For in wielding love as a weapon, she had distanced herself from the very possibility of true love. She could inspire desire, but she could no longer surrender to it. She could command affection, but she could no longer trust it. In her quietest moments, this truth pressed upon her like a shadow. She wondered if the crown had cursed her, making her incapable of ever being loved without calculation, without fear, without betrayal. She wondered if, in turning love into a tool, she had lost the very thing she had once sought most desperately. But she silenced such thoughts. For a queen cannot dwell on longing. A queen must wield what weapons she has. And so she pressed on, using love to bind her ministers, to tame her nobles, to confound her enemies. She walked the dangerous edge of desire with a steady grace, knowing that to falter would mean ruin. History would later remember her as a ruler who blurred the line between affection and authority, who transformed passion into policy, who ruled not only with her crown but with her heart, and in doing so, reshaped both her court and her kingdom. Love had once been her downfall. Now, it was her dominion. The queen's reign, though glittering with triumphs and victories, carried within it a shadow that would not stay hidden forever. Love, that most dangerous of her weapons, was also a double-edged blade. Those who had basked in her affection often believed themselves indispensable, eternal in her heart, only to discover that affection was fleeting when it clashed with her crown. What began as loyalty and passion slowly curdled into resentment, jealousy, and ultimately, ruin. The lovers who once swore to protect her at all costs would, one by one, find themselves crushed beneath the very throne they had served. At first, their downfalls appeared accidental, almost coincidental. A nobleman she had favored fell in a duel, his pride stoked by rivals whispering that the queen no longer smiled upon him. Another, entrusted with overseeing a province, lost his post when his ambition outgrew his usefulness, convinced that his intimacy with her entitled him to more than she was willing to give. Each man believed he could hold her heart forever, and each, in time, learned that her heart was never theirs to keep. It was the crown's, and the crown demanded sacrifice. But the queen was not without sorrow. Though she had grown hardened, she was not unfeeling. Each downfall carried with it an echo of regret. She did not set out to destroy the men who loved her, she sought only to use their devotion to strengthen her rule. Yet power demands a price, and often, that price was the ruin of those who came too close. Among her lovers, some were merely ambitious opportunists, men who believed intimacy with the queen would elevate their station. When their schemes failed, their downfall was swift and merciless. Others, however, had loved her truly, perhaps more truly than she ever allowed herself to love them in return. Their ruin was the hardest to bear, for in them she saw reflections of her younger self, the woman who once believed in love unguarded, who once dreamed of loyalty unbroken. The most tragic of these tales was that of a young knight whose devotion to her bordered on worship. Brave, honorable, and unshakably loyal, he believed that love could transcend politics. She favored him for a time, finding solace in his honesty, his simple heart untainted by the poisons of the court. But as his influence grew, so too did the whispers among her ministers. They feared his hold over her, feared that his sincerity would threaten their schemes. And so they conspired to ruin him, planting doubts in her mind, fabricating accusations, until the queen was forced to choose between her heart and her throne. She chose the throne. The knight was disgraced, stripped of his title, and sent into exile. He died years later, broken and forgotten, while songs of his devotion lived on among the people, who pitied him as one more victim of the queen's merciless reign. Yet not all downfalls came from betrayal by the court. Some came from the lovers themselves, who mistook desire for destiny. One noble, once adored, grew arrogant, boasting openly that he guided the queen's hand in state affairs. His arrogance became his undoing, for the queen could not abide the suggestion that her authority was anything but her own. His fall was sudden and brutal, stripped of lands, cast out of court, his name erased from every document that had once celebrated him. Another lover, a foreign envoy, believed he could bind her through promises of alliance, that his kingdom's armies would make him indispensable. But the queen, ever wary of entanglement, refused to let her heart be traded like coin. When the envoy pressed too far, her patience ended. The alliance collapsed, and his return home was met with disgrace. His king, humiliated, punished him severely, and the envoy who had once dreamed of sharing a crown died in chains. For each downfall, there was a lesson, and the queen absorbed them all. She learned to guard her heart more fiercely, to reveal less, to tighten the leash upon those who loved her. The more she wielded love as a weapon, the more she understood its cost, not merely to others, but to herself. For each downfall left a scar upon her soul, a reminder that power gained through affection was never without consequence. And yet, these tragedies served her reign. The fear of downfall became as potent a tool as affection itself. Courtiers who sought her favor did so with trembling devotion, knowing that to rise close to her was also to risk the steepest fall. Ministers bent more willingly to her will, their ambition checked by the memory of those who had been destroyed. Even her enemies hesitated, wary of being drawn too close to the flame that had consumed so many before them. The lover's downfall became legend. Poets sang of men undone by beauty and ambition, their verses warning others not to mistake the queen's favor for eternal safety. Ballads told of her icy resolve, of how she could smile upon a man one day and condemn him the next. These stories painted her both as enchantress and executioner, as goddess and monster. And in these stories, her power only grew. But behind the veil of legend, the queen wrestled with her own conscience. She wondered if she had become a destroyer, if her crown had turned her heart into a weapon not only against her enemies but against those who loved her most sincerely. She asked herself if she could ever love again, or if the throne had doomed her to solitude masked by power. One night, as she walked alone through her palace gardens, she thought of all the faces of those who had once loved her and were now gone, exiled, ruined, or dead. Their ghosts seemed to walk with her, each one a reminder of the cost of her reign. She felt their eyes upon her, not with anger but with sorrow, as though they pitied her as much as she pitied them. And in that moment, the queen realized that while she had used love as a weapon to defend her throne, love itself had become her greatest enemy. For what is the downfall of lovers if not also the downfall of the one who ruins them? Each broken heart weakened her own. Each betrayal hardened her further, until there was little left of the woman she once had been. She was queen, yes, powerful, untouchable, victorious. But she was also alone, surrounded not by love but by fear, not by loyalty but by necessity. Thus the lover's downfall was not merely their tragedy. It was hers as well. And though history would remember her as a ruler of brilliance and cunning, the truth was simpler and infinitely sadder. She had sacrificed every heart that loved her upon the altar of her crown, and in the end, her own heart was the greatest casualty of all. History is often kinder to monarchs than to their victims, and in the case of this queen, the chronicles carved her name deep into memory. Yet her legacy was never simple, never one-sided. She was a ruler both admired and feared, adored and condemned, remembered for her brilliance yet cursed for her cruelty. To understand her legacy, one must look beyond the glittering crown and the bloody consequences of her passions, into the paradox of a woman who was at once the most powerful and the most vulnerable figure of her age. During her reign, the kingdom did not wither. On the contrary, it flourished. Trade routes expanded, cities prospered, and the coffers of the crown overflowed. Her political cunning was undeniable. She forged alliances that secured her borders, balanced warring factions with deft diplomacy, and kept rivals guessing with her unpredictable strategies. To her ministers and generals, she was both inspiration and terror, for she demanded excellence and punished failure with merciless swiftness. Few could deny that under her hand, the realm was stronger, more stable, more feared than it had been in decades. And yet, for every achievement etched in stone, there was a shadow written in whispers. Her court was infamous not merely for its grandeur but for its danger. The downfall of her lovers became the stuff of legend, and though officially these events were cloaked in the language of justice and necessity, the people knew the truth. They saw a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The queen's affection was a gift that could transform a life, but her rejection was often a death sentence. Some admired her for this, praising her as a ruler too strong to be manipulated by men. Others reviled her, calling her faithless, merciless, even monstrous. This duality became the core of her legacy. To the loyal subjects who lived under the security she created, she was a queen of iron resolve. To the poets who wrote of broken hearts and ruined men, she was a siren who destroyed all who drew near. To later historians, she was a puzzle, a woman who bent the rules of her world to her will, yet paid the price of loneliness for doing so. Her legacy also lived in the laws she shaped. Many of her decrees reinforced the supremacy of the crown, weakening the grip of rival nobles who had once threatened the stability of the throne. By centralizing power, she ensured that the monarchy could not easily be fractured by feuds or conspiracies. This gave her kingdom decades of unity, sparing it from the civil wars that plagued neighboring realms. But critics whispered that her centralization was born not of wisdom but of paranoia, the same paranoia that had led her to destroy those closest to her. Outside the palace walls, her people experienced a reign of contrasts. Taxes were high, but so too were the festivals she sponsored. Justice was harsh, but crime diminished under her watch. Villages spoke her name with both gratitude and fear, for they understood that their prosperity was purchased with her iron control. Farmers saw their markets expand, sailors saw their ships return with wealth, but all lived with the knowledge that disobedience was punished swiftly, sometimes fatally. To love their queen was to live in the shadow of her power, a power that could bless or destroy without warning. The queen's image itself became part of her enduring legacy. Portraits commissioned during her reign show her draped in velvet and jewels, eyes sharp, posture commanding, always depicted larger than life. Yet these same images often conceal a loneliness invisible to brush and paint. Artists, eager to please their sovereign, captured her majesty but not her humanity. It was left to poets and playwrights to hint at the truth, that beneath the crown there was still a woman who longed for love, even as she condemned it in others. Legends about her circulated long after her death, growing grander with each retelling. In some tales she was a goddess, untouched by weakness, a ruler who bent men to her will like twigs. In others she was a villain, cursed by heaven, her beauty nothing more than a trap leading to ruin. Even centuries later, travelers would recount stories of the queen who executed her own lovers, using her as a warning to men who chased ambition too recklessly or to women who dared to seek power beyond their station. But her true legacy may not have been the prosperity of her kingdom or the fear she inspired. It may have been the way she changed how people imagined a queen. Before her, queens were often pawns, married off for alliances, remembered as mothers of heirs rather than rulers in their own right. She shattered that image. She stood alone, sovereign not because of a man beside her but in spite of the men who sought to claim her. In doing so, she carved a place for herself in history as one of the rare monarchs who ruled with both brilliance and brutality, her gender no hindrance to her authority. Yet there is tragedy in this triumph. For while she redefined what it meant to be a queen, she also became trapped by the very role she forged. In defending her power, she sacrificed intimacy. In elevating her throne, she dismantled her heart. Her legacy is therefore not simply one of glory but of warning, that the pursuit of power, when absolute, leaves little room for love. Toward the end of her life, as the crown weighed heavier with age, she is said to have looked back upon her reign with mixed feelings. Some chroniclers record that she took pride in her accomplishments, boasting that no man had ever bent her to his will. Others whisper that she confessed regrets in private moments, admitting that her throne was cold, her palace empty, her bed forever unshared. The truth is likely somewhere between, a queen both proud of her reign and haunted by its cost. After her death, her successors inherited a kingdom stronger than ever, but also one marked by her legend. Ministers invoked her name when justifying harsh decisions. Generals claimed her spirit inspired them in battle. Yet in taverns and marketplaces, common folk still told the quieter stories, of lovers who vanished, of hearts broken by a woman whose love was fatal. Her name became both a crown of laurel and a crown of thorns, both revered and feared in equal measure. Her legacy endures because it is human. It is not the story of a flawless ruler nor of a tyrant alone, but of a woman who lived at the crossroads of love and power, and who chose power every time, even when it cost her everything else. It is this choice that makes her story timeless. For in every age, there are those who hunger for power and those who long for love, and rarely can one have both without sacrifice. The Queen's life is a reminder of that eternal truth, carved not only in the chronicles of her time but in the very fabric of human history. And so, when we speak of her legacy, we must speak not only of the kingdom she left behind, but of the haunting question she left to all who came after: is the price of absolute power worth the emptiness it brings? The answer depends on who tells the story. To some, she was a hero who defended her throne with unmatched brilliance. To others, she was a warning of ambition unchecked. But to all, she was unforgettable, the queen who executed her own lovers, and in doing so, executed the part of herself that might have known peace. The final years of the queen's reign unfolded with the quiet inevitability of autumn giving way to winter. The once vibrant woman who had captivated her court and ruled her kingdom with fire and brilliance began to fade, her strength gradually eroded by time. Yet even as age dulled her beauty and wearied her body, her mind remained sharp, her spirit unyielding. The crown still gleamed upon her head, though now it seemed heavier than ever, pressing down with the weight of decades filled with triumphs, betrayals, and sacrifices. In those later years, the palace that had once been alive with music, feasts, and whispered intrigues grew quieter. Courtiers still flocked to her side, but the air of danger that had once thrilled them had settled into a solemn hush. No longer did men compete openly for her favor. No longer did she stir hearts with the same intensity as in her youth. Rumors of passion and scandal that had once defined her reign gave way to speculation about her health, her succession, and the fate of her kingdom after she was gone. Her body, though once graceful, betrayed her now. She walked slower through her halls, leaned more heavily upon her attendants, and spent long nights confined to her chambers. The courtiers saw only glimpses of her, and when they did, they noticed her face lined with age, her eyes more weary than fierce. Yet even in decline, there was majesty in her presence. She carried herself with dignity, unwilling to let the world see her falter. If her body bent with years, her pride never did. But pride could not keep away loneliness. In her youth, she had sacrificed companionship for power, convinced that love was too dangerous to be trusted. Now, in the long quiet hours of the night, she felt the consequences of that choice most acutely. She had heirs, ministers, and generals, but no one who truly knew her, no one to share in her private thoughts, her laughter, or her sorrow. The lovers who had once filled her chambers with warmth were gone, some disgraced, some executed, others lost to time. Their absence left echoes that haunted her like shadows cast by a dying fire. She often retreated into memory. Sitting beside her window, she would look out at the gardens where once she had walked with favored companions, recalling the sound of their voices, the touch of their hands, the laughter that once made her feel like more than just a queen. But the past offered no comfort. Instead, it reminded her of what she had chosen to give up, or perhaps what had been taken from her by the demands of the throne. She wondered if history would remember her as she truly was, or only as the ruthless figure who had destroyed those who dared to love her. The political landscape of her later years reflected the fragility of her own condition. Though she still commanded respect, younger voices pressed in around her. Ambitious ministers maneuvered for power, eager to secure their positions for the time after her death. Foreign envoys, once cautious in her presence, began to test the strength of her kingdom's alliances. She held them at bay with the authority that remained, but she sensed the slow unraveling at the edges, the restless anticipation of a new era waiting to begin. Yet despite her frailty, she remained a formidable presence in council. Her words carried the weight of decades, her insights sharpened by a lifetime of political battles. Even when confined to her chambers, she dictated decrees, issued commands, and reminded all that the crown was still hers. No one could mistake her fading strength for surrender. To the end, she was queen, and she would not allow the world to forget it. Whispers of her mortality spread nonetheless. Physicians came and went, their remedies offering little relief. Some spoke of fevers that drained her, others of pains that left her unable to rise for days. Ministers argued over her succession, carefully veiled in language of loyalty but steeped in ambition. The people, meanwhile, prayed for her recovery, for though many had feared her in life, they also knew the stability she had provided. The thought of her absence stirred both grief and uncertainty. As her body weakened, her reflections grew deeper. She thought often of legacy, of the decisions that had defined her reign. Was the prosperity of her kingdom worth the loneliness she had endured? Had her brilliance as a ruler balanced the cruelty she had shown her lovers? She questioned whether her sacrifices had been necessary, or whether pride and fear had led her to destroy what she might have cherished. Yet even in doubt, she did not fully repent. She knew the world she had lived in, the dangers she had faced. To survive as she had, to rule as she had, required hardness. Without it, she might have been destroyed, and her kingdom with her. The final months of her reign were marked by a mixture of reverence and dread. Courtiers visited her with hushed voices, bowing deeply, knowing they were witnessing the twilight of an era. The queen herself seemed caught between two worlds, one foot in the realm of the living, the other already stepping into the realm of memory. She spoke less often, but when she did, her words carried haunting weight. To a minister fretting over succession, she remarked, "The crown is heavier than any of you imagine." To a maidservant who wept at her bedside, she whispered, "Do not pity me. Pity those who will wear this crown after me." Her death, when it finally came, was quiet. She passed not on the battlefield, not in the drama of execution or scandal, but in her bedchamber, surrounded by attendants who could not help but mourn. For all the ruthlessness she had shown in life, her passing left a void no one could easily fill. The bells that told her death rang not only for the end of a queen, but for the end of an age defined by her presence. In the days that followed, the kingdom plunged into both grief and uncertainty. Crowds filled the streets, some weeping openly, others whispering stories of her triumphs and her cruelty. Her coffin, draped in velvet, was carried through the city in a procession that seemed to stretch endlessly. People threw flowers into the streets as her body passed, honoring her not only as a monarch but as a figure larger than life. Her final years, though marked by decline, had not diminished her legend. If anything, they magnified it. For in her fading strength, the contradictions of her life stood out all the more clearly. She was remembered as both the queen who had strengthened a kingdom and the woman who had destroyed her lovers. She was admired, feared, pitied, and immortalized, a figure both real and mythic, whose story would be told long after the walls of her palace crumbled into dust. And so, as her reign ended, history prepared to take her into its pages. The queen who had ruled with brilliance, who had executed those who loved her, who had walked the lonely path of power until the very end, left behind not just a kingdom but a question that would echo for centuries: was her strength her salvation or her curse? Long after the queen was laid to rest, her story refused to die. Where her reign ended, her legend began, growing ever larger as generations retold it. In taverns and marketplaces, in monasteries and royal courts, her life became the subject of tales, many embroidered with details more fantastical than true. She was no longer just a queen who had ruled with brilliance and cruelty, she was a symbol, a riddle, a cautionary tale, and in some versions, almost a supernatural figure whose shadow stretched far beyond her lifetime. The first myths took root even before her body was buried. Common folk whispered that the earth itself trembled when her coffin was lowered, as if the land resisted letting her go. Others swore that on the night of her death, a strange storm rose suddenly, lightning splitting the sky above the palace. These stories painted her not merely as a ruler, but as a woman bound to forces greater than human, her presence too powerful to vanish quietly. To the people who had lived under her reign, such tales made sense. They had felt her power so strongly in life that they could not imagine it fading with her death. One of the most enduring legends was that her spirit continued to walk the halls of her palace, draped in velvet, her crown glimmering faintly in the moonlight. Guards claimed to hear the rustle of her robes, courtiers swore they saw her shadow passing through closed doors, and servants whispered that at midnight, her voice could be heard reciting the names of her lost lovers. Whether born of imagination or truth, these ghostly tales gave shape to the lingering sense that she had left something unfinished, that her story had not truly ended. In the countryside, ballads turned her into a figure both enchanting and terrifying. Minstrels sang of her beauty, of how men who gazed upon her were doomed, bewitched by her smile until they met their downfall. Some songs cast her as a temptress sent by fate to punish male arrogance, while others mourned her as a tragic heroine who had sacrificed her heart for her throne. The melodies drifted across villages, carrying her name to people who had never seen her in life, ensuring that even peasants in distant fields knew of the queen who executed her own lovers. As the centuries passed, each era reshaped her legend to suit its needs. To some, she became a warning against ambition, proof that those who reach too high, whether for love or for power, will fall. In this version, her lovers symbolized reckless desire, and her executions were seen as the inevitable punishment of those who forgot their place. To others, she was transformed into a feminist icon long before the term existed, a woman who refused to let men control her, who chose her crown over the chains of love, and in doing so proved that a queen could wield power without compromise. Stories also emerged of secret treasures she supposedly left behind. Folktales told of hidden chambers beneath her palace, filled with gold and jewels collected from her fallen lovers. Some claimed that she had locked away letters, tokens, and gifts from each man she destroyed, sealing them in an iron chest to keep their memory under her control even in death. Treasure hunters searched for centuries, convinced they would find riches or forbidden secrets in the ruins of her palaces. Nothing was ever discovered, yet the belief persisted, a myth too enticing to abandon. Other legends gave her an almost magical aura. In some stories, she was said to wear a ring enchanted to make her irresistible, a jewel that glowed faintly whenever she desired a man's attention. In others, she was rumored to have studied forbidden arts, consulting astrologers and alchemists to guide her reign. These tales painted her as a queen not only of earthly power but of supernatural influence, a figure whose authority stretched beyond mortal boundaries. Though historians dismissed such claims, they persisted in the imaginations of those who needed more than politics to explain the awe she inspired. The myths were not always flattering. In some regions, she became a figure of fear, invoked to scare children into obedience. Parents told stories of the queen who would come in the night to punish those who lied or disobeyed, her crown glowing as she carried away the guilty. These darker legends stripped her of her humanity, turning her into a monster of authority, the embodiment of cruelty and betrayal. Yet even in these versions, her power was undeniable. To call upon her name was to summon an image that commanded instant respect, or terror. Religious storytellers, too, reshaped her into a moral example. To some preachers, she was a sinner punished by God, her loneliness and lack of heirs proof of divine judgment. To others, she was a tragic figure whose sacrifices mirrored those of saints, not in holiness, but in the willingness to endure suffering for a higher purpose. Pilgrims visited sites associated with her, leaving offerings at statues or ruins, as though her memory carried a sacred quality. The lines between history, morality, and myth blurred until few could tell where truth ended and legend began. Perhaps the most haunting myth of all was the prophecy said to have been whispered on her deathbed. Some claimed she warned that any man who sought to rule her kingdom too harshly would suffer the same fate as her lovers, cut down not by swords but by destiny itself. Generations repeated this prophecy, and whenever a king or noble fell unexpectedly, people muttered that the queen's curse had claimed another victim. Whether true or not, the belief endured, reinforcing the sense that her shadow stretched over rulers who came after her. Why did her story endure with such force? Perhaps because it contained the timeless elements that make legends last: love, betrayal, power, sacrifice, and tragedy. She was not a distant figure confined to the pages of law or policy, she was a human drama embodied in one woman. People saw in her both the dangers of unchecked ambition and the tragedy of loneliness. They recognized in her the eternal tension between power and love, between desire and duty. And so, even centuries after her bones had turned to dust, she remained alive in the imagination. Every telling of her myth reveals as much about the storytellers as about the queen herself. Men spoke of her as a warning against female power, painting her as dangerous and destructive. Women, in hushed tones, spoke of her as a figure of strength, someone who had defied the roles imposed upon her. Politicians invoked her name to justify their authority, while artists invoked her to explore the cost of passion. Each generation remade her, shaping her story to reflect their own fears, desires, and questions. In the end, the myths and legends ensured that she never truly died. She lived on not only in history books but in songs, stories, and whispers around firesides. Her image became larger than any one truth, her name a symbol of contradictions, beauty and danger, love and cruelty, triumph and loneliness. Perhaps that was her greatest victory. While other monarchs faded into obscurity, remembered only in dusty records, she became eternal, not just a queen of her kingdom, but a queen of memory itself. And so, when people speak of her even now, they are not simply recalling a historical figure. They are invoking a legend that has survived the centuries, a legend that blurs the line between fact and fable. She remains the queen who executed her own lovers, not merely a woman of her time, but an immortal figure who continues to haunt the imagination of all who hear her story. Centuries have passed since the queen walked the marble corridors of her palace, since her crown gleamed beneath candlelight and her voice carried across courtly chambers. Yet her story has not faded into silence. It lingers, whispered in libraries, retold in classrooms, sung in ballads, and imagined anew each time her name is spoken. Few monarchs of her age are remembered beyond the cold facts of treaties, wars, or dynasties. But she endures, not simply as a ruler who held power, but as a paradox, a woman whose choices left a mark deeper than the walls of her kingdom. When we look back upon her life from across the gulf of time, we are confronted by contradictions. She was both admired and feared, celebrated and condemned. To some, she was a victim of circumstance, forced into impossible decisions by the weight of her crown. To others, she was a calculating figure who valued power above all else. Yet perhaps it is precisely this complexity that keeps her alive in our imagination. A simple figure is easy to forget, but one who embodies opposing truths becomes unforgettable. Modern historians, with their careful records and cautious analyses, try to separate myth from fact. They pore over letters, chronicles, and diplomatic reports, hoping to find clarity. But clarity remains elusive. Was she truly as ruthless as her enemies claimed, or were the stories exaggerated by those eager to tarnish her legacy? Were her lovers executed out of cold calculation, or were their deaths the tragic result of political necessity? The further we move from her time, the more difficult it becomes to know. What remains is not certainty, but the enduring tension between the woman she was and the queen she became. And yet, the uncertainty itself has meaning. It forces us to ask deeper questions, not only about her but about ourselves. Why do we return again and again to her story? Why does her life capture us more than the countless kings who fought battles or signed decrees? The answer lies not only in what she did, but in what she symbolizes. She represents the eternal struggle between personal desire and public duty, between the longing for love and the demands of power. In her, we see the drama of humanity laid bare, magnified by the crown upon her head. Her tale also reminds us of the burdens of leadership, especially for those who break expectations. As a woman ruling in a world of men, she could not afford to appear weak. Every gesture, every glance, every choice was measured against a harsher standard. A male monarch might indulge in lovers without consequence, but for her, such indulgence threatened her entire rule. And so, where others might have turned a blind eye, she wielded the axe. Each execution was not only an act of cruelty but also an act of survival. Her lovers became symbols of the unforgiving cost of sovereignty. It is tempting to judge her by the values of our time, to label her actions as merciless or unjust. Yet history demands patience. We must remember the world she inhabited, a world where betrayal meant more than heartbreak, where a careless romance could topple a throne, where the slightest perception of weakness could invite invasion or rebellion. In such a world, her choices, though harsh, may have seemed not only rational but necessary. To rule was to sacrifice, and no sacrifice was greater than the human heart. Still, the personal dimension cannot be ignored. Beneath the crown was a woman who laughed, who wept, who felt the pull of affection and the ache of loneliness. We can only imagine the weight of signing the death warrants of men she once loved, the quiet nights when the grandeur of her palace walls became a prison of silence. Did she ever regret her decisions? Did she ever wake in the dark, haunted by their faces? We cannot know. But imagining such moments allows us to connect with her not just as a queen, but as a human being, flawed, conflicted, and tragically real. As her legend stretched across time, different generations found different lessons in her life. In some eras, she was condemned as a warning, proof of the dangers of ambition unchecked by compassion. In others, she was celebrated as a pioneer, a woman who refused to bow to the control of men. Today, she might be seen as both, a cautionary tale and an inspiration, a figure who embodies the complexity of leadership in a world unwilling to forgive strength in a woman. Her story resists simplification, demanding instead that we hold multiple truths at once. There is also a universal quality to her tale that transcends the details of her reign. Who among us has not faced the tension between heart and duty, between what we wish for and what we must do? Few endure such choices on so grand a scale, but the essence of her struggle is one that touches us all. This is why her story works so well as a sleep-time lesson, why it lingers in the mind long after the words fade. It is not just history, it is reflection. It teaches not only about the past but about the dilemmas that remain timeless. And so, as we let her story close, we must consider what it means for us. Are we to remember her as a tyrant or as a tragic heroine? As a figure of cruelty or as a woman of resilience? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing one or the other, but in recognizing that she was both, and more. She was light and shadow, love and loss, triumph and tragedy. To reduce her to a single image would be to diminish the power of her legacy. There is also comfort in knowing that history is not static. Just as her story has been retold in countless forms, so too will it continue to evolve. Each generation will remake her in its own image, finding in her life the questions that matter most to them. For some, she will be a mirror of political power. For others, a lesson in love and betrayal. For still others, a reminder that even the strongest hearts can be vulnerable. In this way, she remains alive, not in body, but in meaning. As the final reflections settle, one image rises above all others, the queen standing alone, crown upon her head, her throne both a seat of triumph and a cage of solitude. Around her lie the echoes of voices silenced, of passions extinguished, of choices that shaped a kingdom. In her gaze is not only the pride of sovereignty but the sorrow of all she has lost. And yet, despite the loneliness, despite the tragedy, she remains unbroken. Her figure lingers, steady and eternal, a reminder that power has a price, but also a strange kind of immortality. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson her story offers across time. We cannot escape the weight of our choices, but neither can we escape the legacy they create. She may have executed her lovers, but in doing so she gave the world a story that would outlive both her and them. A story that continues to provoke, to fascinate, to inspire. A story that reminds us of the fragility of love, the cost of ambition, and the enduring mystery of the human heart. Now, as her tale closes and the rhythm of history quiets, we are left with silence, the same silence that filled her palace long ago, the silence of absence, the silence of reflection. But within that silence is a presence, the echo of a queen who refused to be forgotten. She remains with us still, her crown glimmering in memory, her story etched across centuries, her name carried forward as both warning and wonder. The queen who executed her own lovers has passed into legend. Yet through legend, she lives on, not only in the records of history, but in the hearts and minds of all who pause to listen.